This is All India Radio. In the program Spotlight, now we bring you a discussion on the need and importance of digital transactions. The participants are Yamini Agarwal, Economic Analyst, and Ruchika Chitravanshi, Journalist.
In today's program, we are discussing digital transactions, which are not a new concept, especially since the demonetization happened and the pandemic struck us. We use digital transactions not just on our online purchases, but we are also using it so many times to even pay our grocery or our sabziwalas. So, Dr. Agarwal, how do you think India has performed so far in its journey towards digitizing transactions, and how do you see this situation evolving going forward? Because a large part of our country is still not very literate that way in terms of doing these transactions. The penetration, you think, how much more does it need to increase?
And I think the journey to digitalization has been a pretty fast-paced, especially because of the pandemic. Also because of the demonetization, there was a pace which was picked up in digitalization. We also see that there are a lot of activities by the government in terms of promoting digitalization, in terms of giving the payment enablers like the payment banks that we have, or the payment infrastructure that we talk about, like creation of the specific bodies which need to allow the payments to take place. Also, when we look at the fact that the payments have become more customer-centric, that have been there, laying down broadband that connect to the panchayats, then creating an infrastructure of a 24-hour 7 service for RTGS, also bringing about big-ticket reforms in the structure of introducing systems whereby we talk about merchant discount rates. All these factors have led to a certain speed up transactions in digitalization. We moved from 3.8 transactions per capita in financial year 2014 to 22.42 transactions per capita in financial year 2019. We do see that we are still lower in terms of the transactions, what we see in China, which is about 96.7 transactions per capita, and in Brazil about 148.5 transactions per capita. But then many groups, as you talk about, the big techs, have been seeing a lot of opportunities in the digital sphere. It's estimated that the opportunity that they see is about $3.6 trillion. Also, if we look at the value of the digital transactions, they are presently at 769% of the GDP, which it is imagined that it would reach to about 1,500% of the GDP in next 2 years. At 10 crore transactions, we have a possibility of reaching to about 30 crores. With the overall structures of the digital transfers, whether it is in e-governance, receiving payments for the government portals, or bringing about structural changes in overall processes, all has been aiding digitalization.
What are the big challenges now that we have to overcome? As you mentioned that countries like China are ahead of us. Obviously, there is a long way to cover also for us to reach to that level. But what are some of the pointers you would give, let's say, to the government on what it should do?
Well, I think there are different aspects that one needs to look at. One to begin with is a strong digital literacy. Why? Because people need to be assured as to what they're dealing with and how they're wanting to deal with. So they should recognize the digital payment systems that are there. If they have a particular grievance, how would it be addressed? Which particular laws protect them? What are the recourses that they can take in case they are facing problems in the digital transactions, and so forth. One important step which the government had taken was introducing the Pradhan Mantri Jan Dhan Yojana, whereby bank accounts were opened for the rural poor. The Rupaya card or the others were also enablers for digitalization. But again, we do see problems in processing errors, connectivity, authentication failures that are there in the Aadhaar payment. So all these create problems in allowing the digitalization process to go further. Another important aspect that we see is the need for validation services, which need to be provided by public infrastructure institutions like Public Financial Management System or the National Payment Corporation that is there. Again, a dedicated grievance redressal cell needs to be provided by the banks or the other payment banks so that people in their vernacular languages can also reach out for help in case they are undertaking any digital transactions. Another important point is that there needs to be help centers for taking care of cyber crimes or others And the police also needs to be guided in terms of how to handle these e-commerce or e-transaction based frauds that might take place. So that will provide a certain amount of a security to people, a certain amount of a safety to people, and also enable an infrastructure which can further propel digitalization.
You mentioned connectivity is a big issue. Now, that digital infrastructure in our country, we have made quite some strides in creating that digital infrastructure in the country. The mobile penetration is amongst the highest in the world. So, what is it that we need to do more to make sure these issues are tied up?
I think a lot of steps have been taken in terms of the infrastructure that is there. When we are talking about electricity, we are talking about a national power grid system that is there, whereby transfers can be made for surpluses and deficits that are there. Also, when we look at placement of the internet, telecommunications has played a very important role. As we talk about JAM, which is Jan Dhan, Aadhaar and mobile, have been playing a key role in providing for financial inclusion and digitalization that is there. Another important thing that is there, which people are looking at, is where the merchant discount rate is to be reduced so that there is more digitalization and more opportunities for retail traders or the others to participate in the process of digitalization. Again, when we look at the processes which need to be taken care in terms of connectivity, it would be important to see that the telecommunication sector is given the necessary support, which has been recently by giving them a moratorium for the AGR payments which are supposed to be made. So the telecommunication sector has been given the requisite support to further aid the processes of financial inclusion and digitalization. I think that is one of the important steps which would have helped pace the digitalization process. Again, 11 payment banks coming into picture, also ensuring safety and safeguard from the RBI supervision, also making IMPS or big ticket transfers from 2 lakh to 5 lakh or the RTGS to 24/7 system. These are all systems which are aiding the digitalization process.
So we're talking about all sorts of things that are happening in the digitalization of transactions, the steps and the challenges. Can you tell our listeners a little bit about why we are talking of digital transactions, why it is so important, why it is the next step, especially now we are seeing digital currency and bitcoins, etc., which is also posing quite a policy challenge. So can you tell us a little bit about how this whole situation has evolved?
Well, I think when we talk about digitalization, it's one of the important priorities which the government places on what we call as ease of living. So whether you apply for your passport, whether you apply for your driving license, whether you go to the e-commerce market, buying something, whether it is transacting from your bank, whether it is bringing about any kind of a transfer, it is at a click of your button and in your handset through your mobiles or your computer systems that are there. So with one digital transactions, you can increase the amount of economic activity which goes on by bringing about transparency, accountability into the system for both government payments and transfers, for private payments and transfers, and for one's own budgeting and planning. So if you want to apply for a credit card, you have your digital transactions in place which can be given to the bank as a proof. If you want a particular transaction to be recorded or you want to give your business proofs which are there where you are applying for a tender to the government, you can then bring about. There we talk about e-governance in terms of DBT, which is direct benefit transfers to be made to people on the basis of their Aadhaar cards, on the basis of the subsidies which are to be given, without making any cuts or to the middlemen. This transfer directly goes to the bank holder. So whether it is PM Samman Kisan Yojana, whether it is any other Yojana in which the transfers are to be made, they directly reach to the bank holder or to the person concerned without having any cuts involved anywhere. So it brings about better e-governance, it brings about more transaction, enhances the overall activity in the economy, gives a greater choice to people to bring about transactions. And the most important thing, it empowers the common man to live with ease. He doesn't have to stand in queues to get his cash. He doesn't have to stand in queues to get his grocery. He can order it. He can direct it through his home deliveries or through his phones or through his laptop.
In fact, Narega comes to mind because that's also one of the first schemes that started this whole direct benefit transfer along with the LPG scheme, of course. and it has benefited a lot of people. But one challenge that comes to my mind, because when I think of digital transactions, it's a very urban concept and it is used much more in cities as compared to the rural. So how do you see this rural-urban divide when it comes to digital transactions?
There are two things which play an important role here. One is in terms of financial inclusion itself, which PM Jan Dhan Yojana takes care of. Another important aspect is connectivity with respect to electricity and telecommunication services. Again, mobile phones have reached the rural areas and there are transacting. So you have the concept of e-chopals and others coming up in a big way. So they are not distant from the developments that are taking place. Then the other thing that is important is financial literacy as well as digital literacy. So people may be aware that I can transact, but they're not aware if I stop in the processing stage or I stop it in any particular stage, how do I reverse the process? If I am charged double, then what should I do? How do I get my credit back? And so forth. So these are certain things which people are unsure about. Also, people are scared of systems which they are unaware about because there is not requisite help that is being provided. When they go to a bank, they find it difficult to speak to the manager because they feel that he will tell them something which they don't understand and they may lose the money. Or they might not understand why a particular transaction is charged. A very simple process which urban people also face. Their banks charge them for the ATM cards they may not have issued. Now these are certain things which still restrict people. Again, rural divide and urban divide is not to the extent of saying that they may be distancing themselves to the development. What is important is to reach out to them. And I believe when we talk about payment banks or when we talk about big techs coming into play, like phone pays or the others, they can resolve the situation because they are more friendly towards the mobile or the other services which are provided. So you probably can now also transact offline as well as online, which adds on to the advantage.
Of course, there's rural-urban divide, but is there also a generational divide? Is it more of a young generation thing? Like I know my father still likes to go to the bank and he likes to still, not do net banking, etc. I'm sure, there must be lots like him who are scared of net banking.
I think a very interesting thing that we've seen that the younger generations usually always are more closer to any change and they find it easier to bring about or introduce any change to themselves because they are young and it's easier to adapt. For the older generation, it takes a little while to bring about acceptability to the changes that are being there, especially when it comes to technology, because they're used to doing the business in a particular way. But when they understand the benefit of it, whether it is in terms of the softwares which have changed the way the businesses look like, or the way we have been transacting with our government for any particular process, as and when they establish credibility to the system, let's say I know that I can get my bank statement. I know every transaction would be accounted for. I can go to the manager and get my transaction backed out. Let's say if I have not made the payment, I will be given the credit for that. These are certain things. If that particular trust is created, I think the older or the younger generation will come towards the processes of digitalization and embrace it with more positivity than what is usually seen.
So digital transactions clearly are not just the next step, but they are the way we will evolve, and the whole world is evolving. We have to move towards it. And as you very rightly, Ms. Yamini, pointed out, that lots of steps need to be taken from the government side. There needs to be trust that needs to be built. Policy initiatives have to be done. Digital infrastructure also has to be strengthened in the country. So there is quite a lot of road for us to cover still to match with the big giants of the world in this space. Some very good points made by you today. Thank you so much for joining us and sharing your insights.
Thank you so much.
You were listening to a discussion on the need and importance of digital transactions. The participants were Yamini Agarwal, Economic Analyst, and Ruchika Chitravanshi, Journalist. This program was produced and presented by the News Services Division of All India Radio. You can listen to it on our mobile app, News on AIR. This program is also available on our YouTube channel, News on AIR Official. You may email your opinion about this program at airnsdtalks@gmail.com.